Something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles.
Okay, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. We have a special treat for you tonight. Back in living color, live in living color myself. And I also have one special person we're going to talk to today about some very special things that has happened a long time ago. We've heard the descriptions, we've seen the perspectives, and we've felt the rhythms of majority rule. But have that of motherly love? Have you actually experienced that? Motherly love as it relates to majority rule? This evening, we'll explore the perspectives of those that are the foundation of the movement. Hello, 242, and welcome to Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles, and powered by Dom Dev Enterprises, innovative solutions for modern challenges. What you think, you become. What you feel, you attract. And what you imagine, you create. Let's change the narrative 242. Subscribe, like, follow. Don't forget to share. Because this is going to be some heavy, deep stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight. And also, remember, if you want to, we have a advertisement avenue where we help the underprivileged and those of need. So if you want to throw some funds some away, contact us at something to think about 242@gmail.com or on the Facebook page. So tonight we're going to talk with our special guest. And so we have with us, and I don't see the profile. With us, Marion Bethel. The profile. So she is an avid activist, as you may know. She's a special lady because she goes by her name, her born name. As we say, not the government name, the whole name. And so when you hear that name, you know special people, you can just call a name and that's special. And so they know that. And so what we know of Ms. Bethel is that she is actively involved in the women's movement in the Bahamas and the Caribbean since the mid-80s. She has worked in the area of human rights, principally in regards to gender equality, gender-based violence against women and girls, sexual health and reproduction rights, and abolition of the death penalty. In 2012, Ms. Bethel produced a documentary film entitled Womanish Ways, Freedom, Human Rights, and Democracy. The women's suffrage movement in the Bahamas, 1948 to 1962, but we'll question that in a minute. And then in July 2014, Ms. Bethel was awarded the 11th CARICOM Triennial Award for Women for her noted contribution to the field of gender and development in the Caribbean. She was re-elected to the Committee of the United Nations Convention on the Elimination on all forms of discrimination against women in November 2020, and will commence her second term in July 21, which is now. Special people, like I told you, special. You know, come from good blood. So, but we'll leave that there for now. So, welcome, Marion, or should I say Aunt Marion, or I should say Cousin Marion, or what I should say?
Marion.
Lovely Marion.
Thank you so much for having me, Dale, my cousin. Happy. It's really good to be here with you.
Yes, thank you for being a part of this first show as a solo act on Facebook. People have been harassing me for the longest to do this, and
yes.
just put it on the side, but you know, got a little bug with on radio the other day, and now just continue to go forward.
Right.
So everything is revolving around majority rule. And majority rule, in my understanding, is about access, equal access for each and every citizen across the board, whatever race they are, whatever gender they are, whatever religion or creed they are, all of those things, equal access, and for that access to be equally applied. And so we talk a little bit about majority rule, but I really want us to dig into what is, I believe, was the foundation for the movement that allowed that to happen in a big way, right? And so when we look at where we were back in time, when a lot of our young people, including people in my age group, doesn't have an idea as to what were the conditions back then. Could you just touch on that for us, and then and give your definition as to what the majority rule would be?
Okay, well, thank you, Happy. Again, really pleased to be here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the women's suffrage movement in the Bahamas. I think it's important, as I review all of this material, to really understand what majority rule is and what it's about historically, not just in the Bahamas, but what it means as a democratic principle of governance, which applies to any country, not just the Bahamas. I think that we tend to feel that majority rule is peculiarly characteristic of the Bahamas, and it's not, you know? So majority rule as a democratic governance principle simply means one person, one vote, in its most reductive understanding, one person, one vote. And it really is a voting rule that says that the majority is governed, the consent of the majority is required for governance, the consent of the majority. So here in the Bahamas, we certainly attach a racial component or an ethnic component to this, but that is not what majority rule means in its general understanding, dating back to Locke and Rousseau. It's a democratic principle of one person, one vote. And so, and it's a voting rule, which simply means that the majority a majority carries the day in an election, let's say. All right, so I want us just to be very clear on that. Now, in the Bahamas, and majority rule is not peculiar to the Bahamas. You had the struggle for majority rule in southern Rhodesia, where you had a white settler population. You have a majority rule struggle in South Africa. You had it in Bermuda. So it's not peculiar to the Bahamas. And so I want us to really understand that, and to understand that majority rule is a democratic principle of governance.
Yeah.
All right, so let's just keep that. Now, certainly in the Bahamas, it has its racial component, because again, in the countries that I've just mentioned, South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, Bermuda, you had a white minority government. So you have a majority of people who are of one ethnic group and another ethnic group that has the governance that dominates the political structures, the economic and social structures. And so this is what pertained in the Bahamas. And so the way that it translates then, it does translate in many ways into words such as Black majority rule, simply because the ethnic population here that was in the majority were people of African descent. And in terms of the white minority rule of European descent. So I just want us to keep those kinds of concepts very clear in our mind. And so if we look at majority, the road to majority rule in the Bahamas is really one about deepening our democracy or establishing strong principles of democracy. And one person, one vote is one aspect of that. But there are others. You can have freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. These are all components of democracy.
Right.
But the one that we're concerned about tonight, I think, is the issue of the majority ruling, or the majority being represented in governance and political institutions, and therefore majority rule, one person, one vote. So the first time that the Bahamas or Bahamian people really had a stake or a chance to exercise one person, one vote was really in the 1967 general election.
Right, but before you go there specifically, the build up to that, because I mean,
right.
there was a lot of conditions that existed in terms of popular open voting and all kind of Hinduism,
exactly.
What you call it, magician stuff.
Right. So up to 1967. So let's move from 1967 and go back. So in August of 1965, what happened was that the then leader of the opposition, the Progressive Liberal Party, Lyndon O'Pindling, was so determined to enact the principle of majority rule, meaning one person, one vote, that he went along with seven other people to the United Nations to present a petition to the UN to say that the white minority government was frustrating the road to majority rule, okay? And they asked the UN to please persuade Britain, because we were still a colony, and then Britain would persuade the group here to do what it had to do to ensure democratic principles and the road to majority rule. So you had people like Clarence Bain, Milo Butler, you had Reverend Brown, Arthur Folkes, Arthur Hanna, Doris Johnson, and Cecil Wallace Whitfield making this petition.
The same people who are on the other side of the fence now were part of this as one global
absolutely
movement of the people.
Exactly.
And not movement of any political party. It was a people's movement more so than anything else.
Absolutely. So we used the UN in 1965 to make our petition, make our plea for a more for a democracy or an aspect of democracy, one person, one vote. Then moving back from there, this was August of 1965. What precipitated this very, very dramatic move to go to the UN was Black Tuesday in April of 1965, where in Parliament there were again the opposition, the Progressive Liberal Party, was completely frustrated because of the constituency boundaries, which were incredibly unfair and translated to the benefit of the white minority government.
Yeah, what we call gerrymandering. Yeah.
The United Bahamian Party. And so April 1965, again, was one of the very dramatic times in our history, with the mace going out of the window and the hourglass, to demonstrate the people's frustration with the kind of governance that was undemocratic and not allowing participation of the majority of the people to exercise their right to vote. So you had the April 1965. Now, the election of 1962, again, undemocratic in the sense that you had, you still had the plural vote, vote existing in 1962.
So highlight for people what that plural vote means.
What it meant in 1962 and prior to that is that you could have a single person could have more than one vote. So it wasn't one person, one vote. You could vote twice. And your second vote depended largely on property. All right, so if you had a property in Adelaide, for example, you could vote both where you lived, let's say in Nassau Center, and you could vote again in Adelaide. So in 1962, the plural vote was still possible. So this.
Yeah, so just to be quite clear on that though, the plural vote means that if I had property in Adelaide and property in Grand Bahama and property in Auckland, and then I also had businesses, if I know right, then for each one of those, I was able to vote in those places for that thing.
Okay, so let me be very clear. In 62, by 62, the company vote had been abolished. So I'm just dealing with 62 now.
Okay.
So let's go back a little further. In 1959, the company vote was abolished. So yes, if I had a company, and most of these assets translated for the benefit of the white minority government and the white population. So if I had a company and if I had property, prior to 62, yes, I could vote 3-4 times, a single person. You can vote through your company, you can vote through your residence, and you can vote with as many properties as you had prior to 62. But
at one point, they were all open ballot votes, so everybody knew how you voted. Exactly. At one point. Yeah.
So you had open ballot even prior to that, exactly. So it wasn't
intimidation.
So there was all of these kinds of pressures in terms of who voted and how you voted.
Right.
All right. And even before that, up until 1959, when all men could vote. Prior to 1959, not all men could vote. So prior to 1959, only men over 21 who had property could vote, whether you were white or black. There was no racial component at that point, but you had to have property.
Right. Okay.
Right. And then moving on. Yes. And then moving on even so all men could vote in 1962 and all women could vote in 1962. However, there was still a plural vote that was possible.
Right.
Exactly. So from the earliest of times, though, I want to be very clear that the right to vote was based on being white and being male and owning property. That was the earliest, like in the 1700s and the 1800s. Of course, you're talking about slavery also. So there were huge parts of the population that were totally disenfranchised. But traditionally speaking, the vote in the Bahamas was male and white and over 21 with property. And then moving forward, things became a little more improved.
Mm-hmm.
But up to 67, we still did not have the capacity for one person, one vote. And that is why 67 is such a very important date or year in the Bahamas, because we had struggled from the time of slavery for freedom and for democratization, for governance, and it was a long, long process. And so January 10th, 1967 is the culmination of the struggle. And there were many other huge factors along the way. There was the 1958 strike, the general strike, which opened up a lot of possibilities, both for male suffrage, for one, and also for labor rights, for the rights of working people, led by Sir Randall Fox.
Mm-hmm.
So, and even before that, you had the 1942 Burma Road riots, which was really one of the first kinds of mass protests of Black people for their rights and for economic rights in particular, and equality in labor. So we've had a long history of struggle for boundaries, fair boundaries, for constitutional change, and for electoral fairness. And 67 was the culmination of that. And so majority rule is a word that the Bahamians have latched on to with vim and vigor, and it overlaps very clearly with ethnicity in the Bahamas, as it does in Southern Rhodesia, as it did in Africa, in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But you have majority rule in almost every democratic country, but which a different ethnic component. So I just wanted to make that very clear, so that Bahamians begin to think of it in terms of democracy and governance and what that means. Okay,
so on that point, just to put a little bit more context on that, in terms of persons not being able to vote and have a say in its political say or in its leadership and the like, what was the climate like in terms of somebody who lived on top of the hill, below the hill, around the corner from the hill? What did that actually mean? Because when the youth look at it today, they tend to think that everything was today like how it was way back then, and they say, well, you had 50 years to do this and stuff again. You
Right.
didn't do it. I mean, like that the bearing of that don't make logical sense. But if you never were there or wasn't able to see it, then I could see why some people don't have an appreciation of what that means or what the struggle means.
Right, right. So up to 67, we were living under a colonial, we were colonized subjects of Britain, and up until 1834, we were people of African descent were enslaved for the most part, for the majority, and so moving out of slavery into the early 1900s, I mean, the the white elite, economic elite, they had dominance both politically,
Right.
socially, and economically. So the majority of the people were disenfranchised, not only in terms of the vote, but their access, our access to education, our access to health services, were severely diminished, and there was also the social aspect of racism and social prejudice. I mean, Black people could not go into hotels, for example, and were restricted in terms of where we lived. So there was racial segregation. The majority of the Black population was poor, hardworking, and didn't have the kind of access to economic resources and economic empowerment.
When we say poor and hardworking, we're talking about like fishing and
yes, and so yeah,
domestic work or
domestic work, hotel industry, the seasonal tourism industry certainly captured a lot of.
You broke up just now, Marion. Could you
people
because
I'm saying the seasonal tourist industry, which was the captured a lot of the of domestic workers and people working in the hotel industry. There was subsistence fishing, subsistence farming. People were teachers and nurses, and yeah, I mean, there were certainly people who had small businesses, grocery shops, that kind of thing. So it was a very difficult time for Black people in particular to advance in the areas of education and finance, the economy, and politics in particular. I mean, that was very much dominated by the United Bahamian Party and so-called Bay Street Boys.
Yeah, and so when we say United Bahamian Party and Bay Street Boys, we're talking about a small clique of people.
Yes.
Because when you look at it, even those persons who might be as light as me or lighter were not necessarily treated with favor just because they were of the same complexion. That's my understanding, that it really was more of a, for me, type of environment with friends, lovers, and benefits kind of thing, versus it being across the board as a pure racial to-do. I mean, the race issue was there because of the majority of those who had dark color basically was left out. But there were also those who were very light-skinned or white who were not a part of that clique, who were also treated the same way as the Black.
So if you were to have gone into a bank, for example, or a store, it would have been mostly the tellers would have been white, and stores would have been mostly with employees that were either white or very light skinned.
Yeah. So when was it then when people could actually have a bank account? Do you remember that? Because I know my grandmother always used to say, when she would say, let's go down to the penny saving bank and the rest of them, and the importance of that is because a lot of people were not able to have accounts.
Right. So certainly for me, growing up as a child in the mid-50s, I mean, we used to bank at the penny savings bank. I mean, banks like the Royal Bank of Canada, etc., were way out of reach for the average Black Bahamian, for sure. And you really had to have access and connections to have that kind of access.
Yeah. So if we spin back around a little bit and look at that movement up to the majority rule day or milestone, because I see that movement has not really actually stopped, but or should not have stopped, because all of the issues might not have been achieved. The political equality might have been achieved, but all of the social and economic issues that traveled with it,
Yes.
or the hindrance of it, we're still trying to achieve those. So if we look at that, I'm always saying mindful that we had the 400 years of slavery, and then you had the overlap of the 300 years of colonialism. One physically held you back, and the other one mentally held you back in a sort of way, in my interpretation. So when we look at all of that, we had a lot of, not revolts per se, but protests that moved up along the way over a number of years, from, like you mentioned, for the riots and then the strikes and everything that keep building up and getting more momentum. But it really never was hitting the tipping point. My personal view is it's the women who caused it to hit the tipping point. But you know, that a lot of people would argue with me with that. But so what was the movers in the women's involvement and getting involved with the political arena then to cause the majority rules actually materialize?
Well, I would say that post-World War II is really the turning point for a lot of forward movement in the Bahamas. You had the Burma Road riots, for one, of 1942, and then you also had the contract beginning, where many Bahamians left the Bahamas to go on contract in the United States because of the war, World War II. There was a depletion of the workforce in the United States, and so they asked from people from the Caribbean, etc., to go to the United States to do certain kinds of work. So you had quite a bit of the population of the Bahamas, 5,000 or so people, leaving Nassau and going to the contract. And it was there that many of them gained a real sense of being racially oppressed because of the institutions in the United States that further had their aspects to them. So when these people returned home, they brought a certain kind of understanding of that kind of racial oppression, and also could see how it was happening in their own country. So so post-World War II was really a time of acceleration of understanding of decolonization and racial oppression, and trying to resist all of that. And so at the same time, you had women who were becoming much more aware of our own circumstances. The women in the Bahamas post-1942 really understood that women, let's say in Canada and the United States, had been given the vote from 1918 and 1920, and in Britain in 1918. So our women understood this, and they were a part of the lodges and the Elks Lodge and the Eastern Star, etc. And it was in these kinds of social enterprises that women really worked as women, and were further influenced by international movements, because they would have had connections to Elks Lodges and in other parts of the world, or particularly the United States in any case. And so you had people like Mabel Walker, who was a woman from the southern United States, and she had come to live in the Bahamas with her husband, Dr. Walker, and she was very a mover and a shaker in the Elks Lodge. And right. She actually was head of a part of the Elks Lodge, which was called the Civil Liberties Movement. And this was the movement within the Elks Lodge that was very concerned about racial injustice, and it was very concerned about civil liberties and expanding civil liberties for women and men. And so she, along with Mary Ingram and several other women, Simonid, who were all, and these were all lodge people. And so you can see that the lodge had a very specific influence in terms of expanding our understanding of what was happening not only in the Bahamas, but elsewhere, and the sort of cross-fertilization. In the lodges, women gained a sense of their own power. Women gained a sense of governance and democracy because they were presidents and treasurers and secretaries. And so the lodges themselves were like a prototype of democracy in a smaller setting, even though in a broader social setting, you didn't have that. And so
interesting you say that the lodges were a prototype of democracy, because there's so many people today who believe contrary about lodges, but that's just a side note. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, it was there that women really became very educated about issues around civil liberties and racial injustices and what they could do about it. And so one of the things that they were keenly aware of was the lack of suffrage, the lack of the right to vote. And that was one of the things that they were agitating for. The lodges were central to the petitions that were put forward in 1952 and 1965 around, 1952 and 1958 around the right to vote. And so they were quite progressive at that time in these areas, especially around race and politics.
Right. So today we have some almost 400 people. I mean, census would say something different, 400,000 people in the Bahamas, but and I guess women make up about 60-something% of that, or almost 70%.
I think like 51, just over half.
Okay, so you know, my numbers, you know, I'm an engineer, but you know, numbers we look on paper for them. We don't remember them in our head. So back in '58, I think there was some like 54 or 55,000 women out of 100, right? So that it's still about the same percentage as what you saying what we have now. But when we look at the impact of that 54,000 women in particular, bringing the petitions forward, there was a good number presented in the House for various persons on their behalf, and why, if there was the issue of for every one male, that there was about 3 females who would have been literate, if I'm reading that right, in terms of that, and also the powers of the woman in terms of economic purchasing and its use. Could you elaborate on some of that?
So I don't have my handle on the literacy rate in terms of women and men in respect to what you're saying. But what I do know is that the women's movement was very clear that women paid taxes. Women in the Bahamas paid taxes, customs taxes, etc., in the same way that men in the Bahamas paid taxes in that period, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And so one of the issues that they advanced was that if we pay taxes, we should have representation in Parliament. Sure. And they meant that not only for themselves, but for the men too, who couldn't vote because they didn't have property. So the women were so brilliant that they saw that with the American War of Independence in 1776, when they said no taxation without representation, I mean, that was the clarion call for the American War of Independence. Our women said the same thing. You know, you cannot tax us if we do not have a voice in Parliament. Therefore, what you are doing is unjust, it's undemocratic, and we will not accept it. And so, and these women further used the UN conventions coming out of the United Nations to advance their cause. And so I think we really have to shine a light on the brilliance and the political savviness of these women. They were not, untutored and uneducated. They knew what they were doing. They were very sophisticated. And they made alliances with international organizations, including the United Nations, but in organizations in England, organizations in the United States, to help to bolster the cause for the enfranchisement of women, because they knew that women in other parts of the world had already gotten the franchise, and they got support from those women. So people like Mamie Astwood, whom I'm sure you know quite well.
Yep.
She was one of our...
Have no choice.
Yes, exactly. She was one of our suffragists. I've got the petition right here in front of me that she would have signed. So these women were just really, they were organized. They petitioned Parliament. They protested on Bay Street. I mean, they did what they had to do. They went throughout the length and breadth of this country, and the petitions were signed by people in Inagua, in Andros. This was how, hardworking they were and the visionaries that they were. And they had far fewer resources than we do today. And they did the kind of work that they did under very, very trying circumstances.
Right. And you're saying that my understanding is that, especially from my grandmother, that a lot of the women built the confidence because when they had that exposure and were able to see what persons were doing in other parts of the world and realize that they were doing or can have the capacity to do just as good or a better job, that they build up confidence. And then when they networked and got together, as they say, bend down, woman catch a fire, the devil will run. So we have majority rule.
Right, and I mean, and they were very clear that they needed the support of the men in Parliament. The support of Arthur Hanna and all the men who were there, Milo Butler, and so they formed alliances with these people. They formed alliances with Sir Randall Fox and the labor movement. And so, and in fact, they were the backbone of the Progressive Liberal Party. I mean, these women were the backbone of the Progressive Liberal Party. They were also the backbone of the labor movement. And so they straddled many of the associations and the trade union movement and the political parties. Mary Ingram, as you well know, was very much a part of the United Bahamian Party. She and her husband, and so she exercised or attempted to exercise her influence there. So they were very, very savvy and strategic in how they managed and strategized around getting the right to vote for women. And we're at the end of the day successful.
Okay, so now talking about that strategy or strategizing, then we talk about the 62 election and then the 67 election, of which one, I guess the PLP gained the popular vote and one they weren't. And then there's one which said that there's only 2,000 women registered to vote and only 1,000 of them voted. And what was the mindset behind all of that back in that era?
Well, I think in the 1962 election, it appears that the Progressive Liberal Party, with women voting for the first time, did have the popular vote, but because of the, let's call it gerrymandering, let's call it the boundaries, the constituencies being unfairly distributed in terms of population density, you still had the outcome where the United Bahamian Party got the majority of the seats in Parliament based on the way that the constituencies were bounded. And an island like Harbour Island would have 2 representatives compared to, let's say, Grand Bahama, which had a much bigger population and would have only had 1. So the United Bahamian Party regulated the boundaries in its favor, especially. Especially the constituencies on the Family Islands, which were a stronghold of the United Bahamian Party.
Yeah, and so to put that in perspective for some of us, basically we're saying that the Family Islands had, say, maybe 15% of the population, but they had more than half of the seats in the House of Assembly.
Exactly.
At 15%. And so that was part of the equalizing effect of what majority rule but
Met.
one man, one vote plus the distribution and the like would have happened.
Because New Providence had the majority of the population, but,
Yes.
but the seats weren't distributed for the New Providence, correct? So that was.
Yeah. So we know in today's world, there's a bunch of people protesting, but they're not being effective. Why were these ladies effective?
Well, I think they were effective because they used but they used different strategies at different times. So initially, you had Mary Ingram and Mabel Walker, who were both leaders in their own community in the Queenstown and Baintown area. Both of their husbands were members of parliament, so they used that kind of influence there to create public awareness and education. Then moving on from there, you had someone like a Mabel Walker coming in from abroad who brought her own very, very sound university education and further helped to bring awareness along with Dr. Walker to Black people living in the over the hill area around race in particular. And then in 1959, you had Doris Johnson coming in, and she had just come back from university, and she had her doctorate or was about to get her doctorate in education. And she brought a whole nother level of internationalism and connections and networks throughout the UN and other places. And so that all of that combined with the alliances, both local, as I said, they were very clear to align themselves with the labor movement. So Sarando Fox provided an incredible support for the right to vote for women. They aligned themselves with the men in parliament who further carried that. They aligned themselves with the Progressive Liberal Party by and large, because that was the party that was moving for self-determination of the country. And so the alliances were very important. It's very difficult to do something in isolation. So they were very clear on the network and the power of the alliances. They were not fearful about protesting. They protested. They had petitions. They got people to sign petitions. All very, very much a part of what you need. They used the media of the day, like social media, and so it's so much easier. But they used the newspapers, like the Knowles newspaper, which was the organ of the Progressive Liberal Party, to publicize and create public awareness, because you really do need a media to help to advance your cause. So they used they hit all the right notes, in terms of their strategy. Further, when the colonial secretaries, Allen Lennox Boyd, came in 1958, just after the general strike, they met with him and they further pleaded their case to go back to England. They also made a trip to London itself, to Parliament in London, and they pleaded their case there. So they really unturned all of the stones and were fearless in doing that and raising money. I mean, that was obviously one of the things. It's how do you fund a movement? Mm-hmm. And so they usual traditional thing of frying plitters and fish and everything else. And they also solicited funds from wealthier Black Bahamians, and they planned and strategized in all of those ways.
Yeah. So if women were that effective back then to find the ways, and like you mentioned, you said during the Pinnan era, the women were very prominent in the movement of the Pinnan administration's tenure government at that time. What is missing today?
Yeah.
In terms of having the second majority movement in order to take us to the next level.
I mean, I think some of those same determination an understanding of the world. I mean, and I just want to go back to that. These women understood the social currents of the post-World War II era. They understood that decolonization was on its way. They understood that the countries like Ghana and Kenya were fighting for independence, and the countries in the Caribbean were fighting for independence. So they had a big picture of what was happening. It wasn't an isolated sort of insular picture of the Bahamas. The Bahamas was connected to the world. And so,
Right.
so I think that also was one of the strengths. The other strength that I think, and it speaks to the question that you're asking right now, is what is missing, or what these women were well aware that they had to hold what they called public education classes. So they had to create awareness, and they had to teach all of us, their fellow citizens, about democracy, about what this means, about what suffrage means, about decolonization. And they held classes for people in Grantstown and Baintown to know about the injustices, first of all, and also what the possibilities were. And so this was, I think public education and awareness is critical. And so I think it's something that we really need to pay attention to in 2021. So something like reparations, for example, which is very much a hot topic now in terms of reparations for the injustices through slavery. I mean, a part of making that happen is public education and awareness. So I think that is key. Happy in terms of how we make change. So you've got to bring people with you. People have to understand what the cause is and where we've come from and where we're heading and how we think we're going to get there. And they've got to buy into it. They've got to buy into the vision. And so it has to be a vision that is expansive and big and is not insular and contracting, but it's liberating. If I could put it in those words. And that it benefits many people, not just a core few people, you know. I think that's beautiful.
That's your UN training kicking in there, very diplomatic.
Well, as I say, the suffragemen had that down pat. They did that without UN training.
I mean, you being.
I know what you're saying. I'm saying these women had more going for them than many than I do today. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. So when we look at where we are today and moving forward, as you mentioned, you talk about, I guess, our society as a whole, not just the women. So I just want to make that clear. We're talking about the whole society is pretty much gone to insular type attitude versus the village type attitude of helping everybody along the way. Until COVID, then we get slapped about a couple of times, and now we see how we need to never release that and bring it back. Some of the Caribbean countries now have women in very prominent leadership positions. My thing on leadership is that leadership doesn't have to do with positions, authority, or titles, but it has to do with people and people moving people. But are we to a point now where to move forward, we need to have the image of the woman in a senior political position, or is that just a fallacy?
I think, well, you know, this is some of my life's work. So I think as women, we are a part of, we represent about half of the population worldwide, or just over half. I think it's very important for us to have representation at the highest levels of our governance. I mean, and all of our social institutions. It's almost unfathomable for me right now to understand how people cannot see that is so vital and necessary, for many reasons. I mean, the World Health Organization, the IMF have said that, you know, billions of dollars are lost because of the lack of
Yeah.
productivity of women for just the economy, just for the GDP alone.
Right.
You know, so even if you're being instrumentalist and not sort of in spirit wanting this equality, just because it helps the GDP of your country is one way that you could look at it. I mean, it's not the way I look at it. I just think it's
Right.
a principle of life that
Mm-hmm.
that this should happen. We represent half the population. We should have half the representation in Parliament. That is absolutely my position. I don't see it any other way. And so I think it is important to have that kind of representation.
Right. And so is that we haven't advanced ourselves in the last years of such, whether it is 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, whatever it is, in terms of women in having a rightful place. Let me not say rightful place, because a lot of men or a lot of women feel that that's an entitlement. And then there's a lot of men who feel that, okay, because the women feel it's an entitlement, then they need to earn it, and so forth and so forth. So what is the biggest challenge that is blocking?
Well, you know, I mean, it's just a huge right to be treated in a way in their own country in a way that is equal to men. You know, it's an entitlement for all of us to be treated as human beings. So and in terms of political leadership, yes, I mean one has to earn that. But there are many men in political leadership who are there because of the old boys network. They haven't earned anything. So it's you know it's disingenuous of men to actually say that when many of them have gotten where they've gotten, not through their own hard work, but through and so you know exactly.
So when we look at the woman or the female, the woman, female, the male, I think of mother's love, right? And I think mother's love was one of the main reasons why the women in the majority rule movement became so effective, because that was natural for them in terms of taking the lead and doing what is necessary for somebody who is caring. So, but in terms of our society now, we are advanced in leaps and bounds, but now we've come to a plateau. And so in socializing ourselves, we hear people talk about Arlene Nash was on a former show, and she was talking about the education levels and persons, what was happening way back when and what is happening now. And it's looked at to say that we look like we are regressing socially. And a lot of people call that on the family structure, and a lot of people say it's on other things. But I always feel that it evolves around the mother or the mother figure in a community, or the matriarch kind of thing. So looking at our society today, how do we get to leverage this movement of majority rule to be more effective in changing now? We don't do much consultation anymore and the like, but what aspects of the majority rule picture can we draw on to get strengths in order to how to improve what we do now?
Well, as I began saying, majority rule is a principle of democracy. It's a voting rule. So we are still on the road in the Bahamas as elsewhere, including the United States of America, in deepening our democracy and democratizing our governance. I mean, we can see even in the United States, which is supposed to be the bastion and the hallmark of democracy, that their institutions are under threat because of a lot of social injustice.
Right.
So in Bahamas, we have to chart our own course and our own sense of where we see injustices and where we see freedoms waiting for us still to be had. I mean, there are many areas. But I mean, I still don't think we have the kind of economic emancipation that is needed that would impact a broader spectrum of people in the Bahamas. I mean, access to economic resources still has to be looked at for the majority of people in the Bahamas still. And so I don't think that is, I think that's one aspect of majority rule that we still need to really think about, and how that is going to work. So we lift people out of poverty, and our standard of living for people across the board is improved, because there are many areas, as you know, where people are living in desperate situations.
Right.
Just food security, housing insecurity. I mean, yeah. So we still have a long way to go in terms of making the majority rule principle work for the majority of people.
Right.
Yes.
So before we wrap up, because time does sort of fly. Eric Erickson said that in the social jungle of human existence, there is no feeling of being alive without a sense of identity. Right. So moving forward and listening to what the Honorable Loftus Roker had said to us before in terms of who he is, then what would you want to pass on to the general public, whether it's the youth, the women, or whoever, that you feel if you were given the opportunity that you are now to pass on to them, to help them become more confident people like the women of the majority rule movement and affect change in I would say, responsible ways.
Yes. Yeah. What would I say to? Sorry, just can you just rephrase?
Yeah. What would you say to the public, or the youth in particular, and the ladies, that will allow them to build up that confidence on their identity of knowing who they are, in terms of how the women of the majority rule era had built up their confidence? What would you say to them to help them so we could get to the next level?
So I think we still have to persist in our civic engagement and our community work and our community service, and do it in a way that we are in community with other people. So we have to be with each other and understand together what our vision is, what we want for our country, and why we want it, and what are we going to do, what risks are we going to take to make these things happen, and what kinds of programs and or policies, what is it? How are we going to shape this vision and make it into a program of action for our community and our people?
Great. Well, Marion, I would like to really thank you for taking this time. I know we're a couple of days away from the actual day of majority rule, but this has been very informative. I hope a lot of the audience out there pick up some nuggets and some things that can inspire them to move and navigate their way through this, I don't know what you call this COVID thing and the like.
Yes.
But we really would like to thank you for coming on and sharing a lot of this information.
Yes.
And there's so much more.
Yes, there's so much more. And Happy, thank you for the work that you're doing, and this kind of awareness and public education and engagement in conversation. I think conversation is very important. And we can disagree and
oh yes,
still make it happen.
Celebrate bread. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you
All
so
right.
much.
You're welcome. And
Good
say
care.
hello to the good fellows and
Okay.
madam, ladies, and everybody. Okay?
Have a good evening.
All right. Good evening. Take
Bye
care.
now.